Look what the recruitment office dragged in. Commander Brick Hawthorne's voice boomed across the tarmac of Falcon Ridge Air Force Base, his cruel laughter cutting through the morning desert air like a serrated blade. A broken toy trying to play pilot. Captain Skylar Thorne stood motionless beside her assigned F-16, her athletic frame dwarfed by the towering fighter jet. Her long neon blue hair caught the harsh Nevada sun, but it was her right hand that drew every mocking stare. 3 fingers intact, the ring finger ending in a scarred stump, and ugly keloid scars snaking up her forearm like twisted metal. The wounds were old but vicious, telling a story of violence that had clearly left its mark. "Seriously, Ironclad?" Hawthorne continued, addressing Colonel Wade Ironclad, who stood observing from the command tower. "You're putting someone who can't even grip a joystick properly into our elite program? What's next, blind navigators?" 50 pilots and ground crew erupted in harsh laughter. Phones came out, already recording what they assumed would be spectacular humiliation. This was Falcon Ridge, where only the best of the best earned their wings, where legends were born and pretenders were crushed. Skylar's hazel eyes remained fixed on her aircraft's pre-flight checklist, her damaged hand moving with surprising precision despite the tremor. She said nothing, but something in her posture, the absolute stillness, the economy of movement, suggested depths these cocky pilots couldn't fathom. "I bet she can't even reach the ejection handle," someone called out. They had no idea they were about to witness the return of a ghost. The morning briefing had begun like any other at Falcon Ridge, but Hawthorne's announcement changed everything. Standing at the podium in his crisp flight suit, his chest heavy with ribbons earned in Iraq and Afghanistan, he commanded the kind of respect that came from 300 confirmed combat missions. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried across the packed briefing room, "today we have a special demonstration. Our newest arrival, Captain Thorne, has requested to participate in advanced combat training." The word requested dripped with sarcasm. "I've decided to personally evaluate her capabilities in a one-on-one aerial engagement." The room buzzed with excitement. Hawthorne was known as the Falcon Ridge Ace, undefeated in over 200 training dogfights. His kill ratio in actual combat was classified, but the rumors spoke of numbers that bordered on the impossible. If you've ever been underestimated because of how you look, hit that subscribe button right now. Trust me, what happens next will make you believe that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone dismisses. And don't forget to ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming. Captain Rex Boulder, sitting in the front row with his squadron, couldn't help but shake his head. Rex was a legend in his own right, a pilot whose reputation had been forged in the skies over Syria 5 years ago. He'd lost his entire squadron in a mission that went sideways, the sole survivor of Phoenix Squadron's final flight. The trauma had left him cautious, protective of younger pilots who reminded him of the friends he'd failed to save. "This isn't training," Rex muttered to the pilot beside him. "This is execution. Hawthorne's going to tear her apart up there." But something nagged at him as he watched Skylar perform her pre-flight inspection. The way she moved around the aircraft wasn't amateur fumbling. Her damaged hand traced control surfaces with a familiarity that spoke of thousands of hours, not hundreds. When she checked the pitot tubes, her movements were automatic, unconscious, the kind of muscle memory that took years to develop. Young Cadet Riley Martinez sat in the back row, notebook in hand, studying every pilot who passed through Falcon Ridge. At 19, Riley was the youngest cadet ever accepted into the program, a prodigy who'd earned a full scholarship through academic excellence rather than family connections. Unlike the others, Riley wasn't laughing at Skylar's disability. Something about the way the captain carried herself reminded Riley of the old-school pilots, the ones who had learned their trade when mistakes meant death. The briefing room's atmosphere was electric with anticipation as Colonel Ironclad stepped to the podium. Ironclad was old-school Air Force, a man who had climbed the ranks through merit rather than politics. His weathered face bore the marks of a career spent in cockpits and command centers, making decisions that shaped the future of American air power. "The engagement will take place in Sector 7, Ironclad announced, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Standard BVR rules, Fox 2 simulated missiles only. First lock wins." He paused, his eyes finding Skylar in the crowd. "Captain Thorne, are you sure you're up for this?" Skylar stood, her voice steady despite the weight of 50 pairs of eyes. "Yes, sir. I'm ready." Hawthorne's grin was predatory. "Outstanding. I do love a challenge." The laughter that followed was harsh, mocking. Someone in the back called out, 10-1 odds on Hawthorne. "Make it 20-1, another voice added. "This won't last 5 minutes." The betting started immediately, with nearly every pilot and crew member wagering against Skylar. The amounts grew rapidly, $100 here, $500 there. Even the senior NCOs were getting in on the action, their decades of experience telling them this was easy money. Riley watched the spectacle with growing unease. There was something wrong with this picture, something the others were missing. When Skylar walked past on her way to the aircraft, Riley caught a glimpse of something that made no sense. The woman's flight suit bore the faint outline of removed patches, the kind of ghostly marks left behind when unit insignias were stripped away. Why would a new pilot have old patches removed? Outside on the tarmac, the pre-flight preparation began in earnest. Skylar's assigned aircraft was tail number 8773, an F-16C that had seen better days. The maintenance logs showed it was airworthy, but barely. Someone had made sure she got the worst bird in the squadron. Chief Master Sergeant Dalton supervised the pre-flight, his massive frame towering over Skylar as she conducted her inspection. Dalton was Hawthorne's man through and through, a 25-year veteran who had earned his stripes keeping prima donna pilots alive. He watched with barely concealed amusement as Skylar's damaged hand struggled with certain inspection points. "Need any help there, Captain?" Dalton's voice was professionally neutral, but the smirk on his face told a different story. "That hand giving you trouble?" Skylar didn't respond, focusing instead on checking the aircraft's control surfaces. But as she worked, something extraordinary became apparent to anyone with the experience to recognize it. Her inspection wasn't following the standard checklist. Instead, she was performing a combat-level verification, the kind of detailed examination that pilots used when their lives depended on every rivet and wire. She found the first problem within minutes, a loose connection in the radar warning receiver that would have caused system failures at altitude. The second issue was more serious. Hydraulic fluid levels that were technically within specifications, but close enough to the minimum to cause problems under high G maneuvering. "Chief," Skylar called out, her voice carrying across the tarmac, "I need a hydraulic top-off and an RWR connection tightened." Dalton ambled over, his expression skeptical. "The logs show everything's green, Captain. Maybe you should trust the professionals who've been doing this since before you were born." But when he checked her findings, his smirk faded. Both problems were real, and either one could have caused mission failure or worse. He called over his maintenance team, issuing orders with the crisp efficiency of a man who'd just been reminded why attention to detail mattered. The sight of Skylar outperforming seasoned maintenance personnel spread through the assembled crowd like wildfire. Suddenly, the betting odds weren't looking quite as certain. A few smart money bettors quietly adjusted their wagers, though most still favored Hawthorne by overwhelming margins. Skylar's specialized flight gloves featured advanced haptic feedback technology originally developed for disabled pilots, incorporating pressure-sensitive fingertips and neural pathway stimulation to compensate for missing digits. The military-grade assistive equipment utilized cutting-edge biomechanical engineering with titanium reinforcement and proprietary grip enhancement systems, enabling precise aircraft control despite severe hand trauma. This revolutionary adaptive technology represented millions in research and development costs. Riley Martinez had positioned himself near the aircraft to get a better view of Skylar's preparation routine. As a cadet, he was supposed to be learning from experienced pilots, and something told him this was going to be an education unlike any other. What he saw as Skylar suited up defied his understanding of how disabled pilots typically adapted to flight operations. Her pre-flight routine was flawless, but more than that, it was instinctive. She never consulted the checklist, never hesitated, never second-guessed herself. When she climbed into the cockpit, her movements flowed with a grace that spoke of countless repetitions. The way she settled into the ejection seat, the automatic adjustment of mirrors and displays, the unconscious placement of her hands on the controls, everything screamed veteran pilot, not rookie. But there was something else, something that made Riley's pulse quicken. As Skylar adjusted her flight suit collar before donning her helmet, the fabric shifted slightly. For just a moment, Riley caught a glimpse of black ink at the base of her neck, the edge of what looked like a tattoo. In the harsh Nevada sun, he couldn't make out details, but the positioning and style looked military. "Martinez!" Sergeant Kowalski's voice cracked like a whip. Get away from that aircraft and rejoin the observation area. You're not here to gawk. Riley snapped to attention, but his mind was racing. Something about Skylar Thorne didn't add up. New pilots didn't move like that, didn't inspect aircraft like that, and they certainly didn't correct maintenance issues that experienced crew chiefs had missed. Meanwhile, Hawthorne was holding court near his own aircraft, a pristine F-16C that had been specially modified for training purposes. His maintenance crew treated him like royalty, their deference earned through years of successful missions and training exercises. His aircraft bore the markings of dozens of kills, both training and combat, a visual reminder of why he was considered untouchable at Falcon Ridge. "Gentlemen," Hawthorne addressed the crowd that had gathered around him, "today you're going to witness the difference between real pilots and pretenders. That woman has no business in a fighter cockpit, and I'm going to prove it in front of all of you." His wingman, Major Carson Blake, nodded approvingly. Blake was Hawthorne's closest ally, a pilot whose own reputation was built on following in the commander's wake. "How long you figure it'll take, Brick? 2 minutes? 3? "I'm being generous with 5, Hawthorne replied, his confidence absolute. "She'll panic the moment I get on her tail. Mark my words. She'll call bingo fuel and head home before we even engage." The gathered pilots laughed and nodded. They had all seen it before, cocky newcomers who talked a big game until they faced real combat maneuvering. The physical stress alone would be overwhelming for someone with a disability, never mind the mental pressure of facing Falcon Ridge's best pilot. Colonel Ironclad watched the proceedings from the tower, his expression unreadable. He'd seen a lot of pilots come and go over his 28-year career, had learned to read the signs that separated the wheat from the chaff. Something about Skylar Thorne intrigued him, though he couldn't put his finger on what. Her personnel file was thin, almost suspiciously so. Standard basic flight training, followed by advanced tactical instruction at Luke Air Force Base. No combat deployments listed, no special qualifications, no awards or decorations. For a captain with her apparent experience level, the record was oddly sparse. But Ironclad had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts were telling him there was more to this story. The way she'd handled the maintenance issues, the confidence in her movements, the complete lack of nervousness in the face of overwhelming hostility, none of it matched the profile of a typical new arrival. His aide, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, appeared at his elbow with a fresh cup of coffee and a concerned expression. "Sir, are you sure about this engagement? The pilot seems unprepared for this level of opposition." Ironclad accepted the coffee gratefully, his eyes never leaving the tarmac below. "Sometimes, Colonel, the best way to evaluate a pilot is to put them under maximum stress. We'll know everything we need to know about Captain Thorne in the next hour." But even as he spoke, doubt crept into his voice. Something about this situation felt off, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. It was the kind of feeling that had kept him alive through 3 combat tours and countless training accidents. The sense that important information was missing from the equation. Drop a comment below if you've ever had your abilities questioned because of your appearance. Share this video with someone who needs to see that true strength comes in unexpected packages. Down on the tarmac, the final preparations were underway. Both aircraft had been fueled and armed with simulated weapons systems. The engagement would be conducted over the Nevada Test Range, where sophisticated tracking equipment could monitor every movement and determine the winner with precision accuracy. Riley had managed to position himself near the departure area, ostensibly to observe standard procedures, but actually to get another look at Skylar. As she walked toward her aircraft for the final time, her flight suit again shifted at the collar. This time, Riley was ready, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The tattoo wasn't just any military insignia, it was a pair of wings, specifically the stylized raptor wings used by Phoenix Squadron. Riley knew the symbol because he'd studied every famous fighter unit in Air Force history. Phoenix Squadron had been legendary, an elite group of pilots who'd undertaken the most dangerous missions in Syria 5 years ago. Phoenix Squadron had also been completely wiped out in a classified operation, their names carved into the memorial wall at the Air Force Academy. Riley had seen that wall, had memorized every name, including the unit's commanding officer, Captain Sarah Phoenix Thorne. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. The tactical knowledge, the instinctive aircraft handling, the mysteriously thin personnel file. Skylar wasn't just any pilot. If Riley's suspicions were correct, she was supposed to be dead, but there was no time to process this revelation. The engines were spooling up, and both aircraft were preparing for departure. Riley watched in stunned silence as Skylar's F-16 taxied toward the runway, her damaged hands somehow managing the complex throttle and stick inputs required for ground operations. The tower's voice crackled over the radio frequency that the entire base was monitoring. Falcon 773 and Falcon 115, you are cleared for combat area entry. Proceed to assigned altitudes and await engagement authorization. Hawthorne's voice came back immediately, crisp and professional. Falcon 115, roger. Proceeding to flight level 250. Skylar's response was quieter, but equally clear. Falcon 773, proceeding to flight level 240. As the two fighters disappeared into the desert sky, the crowd on the ground settled in to watch what promised to be a very short engagement. The betting had reached astronomical proportions, with some pilots wagering entire monthly salaries on the outcome. Everyone was so certain of the result that they were already planning how to spend their winnings. Only Riley Martinez stood apart from the celebration, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd discovered. If he was right, if Skylar really was Sarah Phoenix Thorne, then everyone on the base was about to witness something extraordinary. Phoenix Squadron's commanding officer hadn't earned her reputation through luck or politics. She'd been the most feared pilot in the Syrian theater, a woman whose kill count was classified because the numbers were too sensitive for public consumption. The radio crackled to life as the aircraft reached the designated combat area. Falcon 773 and Falcon 115, you are cleared for engagement. Fights on, fights on. High above the Nevada desert, two F-16s began a deadly dance that would change everything the watchers below thought they knew about skill, determination, and the price of survival. The engagement began with textbook precision, both aircraft maneuvering for initial positioning advantage. Hawthorne, confident in his superior experience and undamaged aircraft, immediately went for an aggressive opening gambit, a high G climbing turn designed to get above his opponent and force an energy disadvantage. It was exactly the kind of move that worked against 90% of pilots, particularly those flying inferior aircraft. The G-forces alone should have been overwhelming for someone with a physical disability, and Hawthorne fully expected to hear Skylar's panicked voice, calling for a timeout within the first 30 seconds. Instead, Skylar's F-16 seemed to anticipate his move, rolling inverted and pulling through a barrel roll that not only avoided the trap, but actually gained her an energy advantage. The maneuver was so smooth, so perfectly executed, that it looked effortless from the ground-based tracking cameras. What the hell? Hawthorne's voice leaked over the radio, his professional composure cracking slightly. The move Skylar had just pulled required split-second timing and the kind of spatial awareness that came from years of combat experience. It wasn't something you learned in a training environment. On the ground, the crowd's cheering began to falter. What they'd expected to be a quick demolition was turning into something else entirely. The tracking displays showed both aircraft maneuvering with equal skill, neither able to gain a decisive advantage. Colonel Ironclad leaned forward in his chair, his coffee forgotten. "What's her G tolerance showing?" he asked his aide. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez checked the telemetry displays, her eyebrows rising in surprise. 8.7 Gs on that last maneuver, sir, sustained for 12 seconds. Ironclad's mouth went dry. 8.7 Gs was well beyond what most pilots could handle, even with G-suits and years of conditioning. For someone with a disability to not only sustain that load, but execute a complex maneuver while doing it, it defied medical understanding. Up in the air, Hawthorne was discovering that every advantage he'd counted on was rapidly disappearing. His opponent wasn't just competent, she was something else entirely. Every move he made was countered with precision that bordered on prescience. When he tried to force an overshoot, she wasn't there. When he attempted to drag her into a low-speed fight where his experience should have dominated, she maintained perfect energy management. "This is impossible," he muttered over the intercom, his voice tight with frustration and growing concern. He'd never faced an opponent who could match him move for move, especially not someone flying a substandard aircraft. But Skylar wasn't just matching him. She was starting to take control of the engagement. Her F-16, despite its maintenance issues, was being flown with a precision that extracted every ounce of performance from the aging airframe. When Hawthorne tried a defensive spiral, she stayed glued to his 6 o'clock with supernatural persistence. The crowd on the ground watched in stunned silence as the tables slowly turned. What had started as a foregone conclusion was becoming a masterclass in aerial combat, with the supposed underdog demonstrating skills that shouldn't have been possible. Riley Martinez found himself holding his breath as the engagement continued. Every maneuver Skylar executed confirmed his suspicions. This wasn't just any pilot. This was someone with combat experience at the highest levels. Someone who had learned these skills in environments where mistakes meant death. The comprehensive disability insurance policy, covering military pilots, included specialized coverage for combat-related injuries, with benefit payouts reaching multiple millions for career-ending trauma. This elite insurance program provided extensive rehabilitation funding, adaptive equipment costs, and lifetime income protection specifically designed for high-risk aviation personnel with advanced medical care provisions. As the dogfight entered its 5th minute, Hawthorne was beginning to panic. He'd thrown everything in his arsenal at this opponent, every trick he'd learned in 15 years of flying, and nothing was working. Worse, he was starting to feel like prey rather than predator, constantly reacting to moves that seemed to come from nowhere. "Come on, Brick!" Major Blake's voice crackled over the radio from his position as safety observer. "What's taking so long? Finish her off!" But Hawthorne couldn't finish her off, because he was no longer in control of the fight. Skylar had methodically dissected his tactical approach, identified his weaknesses, and was now exploiting them with surgical precision. When he tried to extend and reset the engagement, she cut him off. When he attempted to use vertical maneuvering to gain altitude advantage, she anticipated the move and countered perfectly. The tracking data showed a story that defied belief. Skylar's aircraft was pulling maneuvers that should have been impossible, given its maintenance status and her physical limitations. The G-forces she was sustaining, the precision of her weapons tracking, the flawless execution of complex aerial tactics, everything pointed to a level of skill that took decades to develop. On the ground, the betting crowd was beginning to realize they might have backed the wrong horse. Whispered conversations spread through the group as pilots who'd been certain of easy money started calculating their potential losses. Chief Master Sergeant Dalton stood near the maintenance trucks, his expression grim. He'd been in the Air Force long enough to recognize exceptional piloting when he saw it, and what was happening above the desert was beyond exceptional. It was the kind of flying that separated legends from mortals. "Who the hell is this woman?" he muttered to his assistant crew chief. It was a question that more people were beginning to ask. Skylar's personnel file might be thin, but her performance in the air was telling a very different story. This wasn't a disabled rookie struggling to keep up. This was a master at work, demonstrating skills that belonged in the top 1% of military aviation. The engagement was about to enter its most critical phase, and everyone watching was beginning to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The only question was whether Hawthorne could salvage his reputation before it was too late. Above the Nevada desert, 2 fighters continued their deadly ballet, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The only mystery was how completely the supposed underdog would dominate one of the Air Force's most decorated pilots. The turning point came at minute 7, when Hawthorne made a critical error born of desperation and wounded pride. Abandoning the careful energy management that had kept him competitive, he pulled his F-16 into a vertical climb that bled off airspeed in exchange for altitude. It was a gamble that might have worked against a lesser pilot, but Skylar read the move like a book. Instead of following him up, she executed a perfect lag pursuit, maintaining her energy while letting gravity do the work of slowing Hawthorne's climb. When his aircraft reached the apex of its ascent and began to nose over, she was perfectly positioned for what pilots call a gun's kill, the aerial equivalent of an execution. "Falcon 115, you have tone," the range controller's voice echoed across the radio frequencies, confirming what everyone could see on their tracking displays. Skylar had achieved a perfect missile lock on Hawthorne's aircraft, the kind of kill position that was impossible to escape. But it was what happened next that truly shocked the watching crowd. Instead of immediately calling the kill and ending the engagement, Skylar held position, maintaining her lock while giving Hawthorne every opportunity to attempt an escape. It was a display of confidence so absolute, so contemptuous, that it bordered on cruelty. Hawthorne tried everything: desperate barrel rolls, defensive spirals, chaff deployment to break the lock. Nothing worked. Skylar's F-16 stayed glued to his tail like a shadow, her weapon system maintaining perfect tracking despite the increasingly frantic evasive maneuvers. "Kill, kill, kill," Skylar's voice finally came over the radio, the words delivered with the calm professionalism of someone announcing the weather. Falcon 773 has killed Falcon 115 with simulated AM-9X. The silence that followed was deafening. On the ground, 50 pilots and crew members stood frozen, their brains struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. The impossible had happened. The disabled rookie had not just defeated, but completely dominated the base's ace pilot. Colonel Ironclad slowly set down his coffee cup, his hands not quite steady. In 28 years of flying and commanding pilots, he'd never seen anything like what had just unfolded above the desert. The tactical sophistication, the technical precision, the absolute mastery of aerial combat, it was the kind of performance that belonged in classified after-action reports, not training exercises. "Sir," Lieutenant Colonel Martinez's voice was barely above a whisper, "the telemetry data is unprecedented. She pulled maneuvers that shouldn't be possible given her equipment and supposed experience level." Ironclad nodded slowly, his mind racing through the implications. Either they'd just witnessed a once-in-a-generation prodigy, or there was something fundamentally wrong with Skylar Thorne's official record. The smart money was on the latter. Riley Martinez stood apart from the stunned crowd, his heart pounding with the certainty of his earlier suspicions. What he'd just watched wasn't just exceptional flying. It was the demonstration of skills that could only have been earned in actual combat, under conditions where failure meant death. The Phoenix Squadron tattoo he'd glimpsed suddenly made perfect sense. If Skylar really was Sarah Phoenix Thorne, then what they'd just witnessed was the return of a ghost, a pilot whose reputation had been built in the deadliest skies on Earth. As the two aircraft began their descent back to Falcon Ridge, Riley made a decision that would change everything. The truth needed to come out, regardless of the consequences. Someone needed to tell the story of who Skylar Thorne really was, and why she was hiding among them. The landing pattern was executed with the same precision that had characterized the entire engagement. Hawthorne's F-16 touched down first, his approach slightly unstable, a clear sign of a rattled pilot trying to salvage some dignity. Skylar's landing was textbook perfect, her damaged hands somehow managing the complex throttle and stick inputs required for a carrier-quality touchdown. As the engines wound down and the aircraft were secured, the crowd on the tarmac remained unnaturally quiet. The betting slips clutched in dozens of hands had become worthless paper, fortunes lost on what everyone had considered a sure thing. Hawthorne climbed out of his cockpit first, his movements stiff and awkward. The confident swagger that had characterized his pre-flight routine was gone, replaced by the mechanical motions of someone going through the motions while their mind processed defeat. When Skylar emerged from her aircraft, something remarkable happened. As she removed her helmet and shook out her neon blue hair, the harsh desert wind caught her flight suit collar, pulling it aside for just a moment. The wing tattoo that Riley had glimpsed earlier was now clearly visible to anyone close enough to see. Riley stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Phoenix Squadron," he said, his words carrying clearly across the tarmac. "That's a Phoenix Squadron tattoo." The effect was electric. Heads turned, conversations stopped, and suddenly all attention focused on the young cadet who had just made an impossible claim. Phoenix Squadron was legendary among Air Force pilots, but they were also dead. Every last member killed in a classified operation 5 years ago. "That's impossible," Major Blake said, his voice uncertain. "Phoenix Squadron was wiped out in Syria. There were no survivors." But Riley was already moving towards Skylar, his academy training and military history giving him the confidence to make an accusation that sounded insane. Phoenix Squadron's commanding officer was Captain Sarah Phoenix Thorne. She was listed as killed in action on April 15, 2019. The date hung in the air like a physical presence. Every pilot on the base knew the story of Phoenix Squadron, had heard whispered accounts of their final mission and the heroic death of their commander. But the woman standing before them was very much alive, and very much not the rookie pilot they'd assumed her to be. Skylar's reaction was the final piece of evidence Riley needed. Instead of confusion or denial, her expression showed only resignation, as if she'd been waiting for this moment for years. Her hazel eyes met Riley's with something that might have been gratitude, as if she was tired of carrying the weight of her secret alone. "That's ridiculous," Chief Master Sergeant Dalton stepped forward, his voice loud and authoritative. "You're talking about a dead woman, son. This is Captain Skylar Thorne, transferred here from Luke Air Force Base 3 weeks ago." But even as he spoke, doubt crept into Dalton's voice. The pieces were starting to fit together in ways that couldn't be ignored. The exceptional maintenance knowledge, the combat-level flying skills, the mysterious personnel file, everything pointed to a conclusion that seemed impossible but felt increasingly inevitable. If this story is hitting you right in the feels, smash that like button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone completely surprise everyone around them? The confrontation might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the arrival of someone whose word carried absolute authority. Master Sergeant Tom Richardson emerged from the operations building, his weathered face bearing the kind of scars that came from too many close calls in too many war zones. Richardson was a legend at Falcon Ridge, a combat veteran whose reputation transcended rank and service boundaries. He'd served as crew chief for some of the most decorated pilots in Air Force history, and his word on matters of pilot identification carried weight that couldn't be challenged. He walked directly to Skylar, his eyes taking in every detail of her appearance with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned to read people under the worst possible circumstances. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of absolute certainty. "Phoenix," he said simply, the word hitting the assembled crowd like a physical blow. "I worked on your bird for 3 years in Syria. That scar on your hand is from the ejection seat malfunction during the Aleppo mission. The keloids on your arm are from the cockpit fire that should have killed you." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of jet engines from other parts of the base. Richardson's identification carried the weight of gospel truth, confirming what Riley had suspected and what everyone else had refused to believe. Skylar looked at Richardson for a long moment, her expression cycling through relief, resignation, and something that might have been gratitude. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weariness that spoke of years spent hiding in plain sight. "Hello, Tom," she said quietly. "I wondered if you'd recognize me." The admission sent shockwaves through the crowd. This wasn't just any pilot with a coincidental resemblance. This was Sarah Phoenix Thorne, the most decorated female fighter pilot in modern Air Force history, a woman whose exploits had been classified because they were too sensitive for public consumption. Colonel Ironclad's aide whispered urgently in his ear, and his face went pale as the implications sank in. If Skylar really was Phoenix, then her presence at Falcon Ridge wasn't coincidence. It was part of something much larger and more complex than a simple training assignment. But before anyone could process this revelation further, the situation was about to become even more complicated. In the distance, the distinctive sound of rotor blades announced the arrival of visitors who would change everything the assembled pilots thought they knew about their new colleague. The UH-60 Blackhawk that settled onto the tarmac bore no unit markings, its flat black paint scheme and tinted windows suggesting the kind of official secrecy that made career officers nervous. When the doors opened, 8 men in civilian clothes emerged, their movements and bearing screaming special operations, despite their unremarkable appearance. The team leader was a tall man with gray eyes and the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. He surveyed the assembled crowd with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating threats and opportunities in equal measure. "Captain Thorne," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the tarmac. "We need to talk." Advanced pilot certification programs utilizing virtual reality training systems enabled rapid skill assessment and accelerated learning curves for specialized military aviation roles. These intensive courses combined classroom instruction with cutting-edge flight simulation technology, providing comprehensive education pathways for elite pilot development with guaranteed placement opportunities in specialized units. The arrival of the Special Operations Team transformed the situation from a base-level controversy into something with national security implications. As the civilians approached, every pilot and crew member present understood that they were witnessing events far beyond their security clearance level. The team leader stopped directly in front of Skylar, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of classified authority that could not be questioned or challenged. "Captain Thorne," he said formally, "your cover has been compromised. We're implementing immediate extraction protocols." The words hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Cover, extraction protocols. The language of intelligence operations and classified missions, not routine training assignments. Everything they thought they knew about Skylar Thorne was being rewritten in real time, but Skylar's response was even more shocking than the team leader's announcement. Instead of compliance or relief, her expression hardened with something that looked like defiance. "Negative," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "The mission isn't complete. I need more time. The implications of her words were staggering. Mission, not assignment, not duty, mission. The kind of word that suggested objectives more complex than pilot training. Goals that required the kind of deep cover that could only be maintained by someone with her extraordinary skills. Colonel Ironclad stepped forward, his command authority finally asserting itself over the chaos of revelation and confusion. I think it's time someone explained exactly what's going on here. Who is Captain Thorne? And what kind of mission requires this level of deception? The team leader's response was delivered with the kind of cold professionalism that ended conversations rather than encouraging them. Colonel, you are not cleared for this information. Captain Thorne's status and mission parameters are classified above your security level. But Riley Martinez, emboldened by his earlier success in identifying Skylar, stepped forward with the kind of academic precision that had earned him his place at Falcon Ridge. Phoenix Squadron's final mission was designated Operation Lazarus. The official record states that all personnel were killed in action, but the after-action reports were classified so deeply that even the basic mission parameters remained sealed. He paused, his young face intense with the excitement of putting together pieces of a puzzle that had confounded military historians for years. But if Captain Thorne survived, if she's been operating under deep cover for 5 years, then Operation Lazarus might not have been the failure everyone assumed. The team leader's expression didn't change, but something in his posture suggested that Riley's analysis was uncomfortably close to classified truth. When he spoke, his words carried a warning that even young cadets could understand. Mr. Martinez, you are approaching information that could result in your permanent reassignment to very remote locations. I suggest you limit your speculation to matters within your clearance level. But the damage was already done. Riley's words had planted seeds of understanding that were already taking root in the minds of everyone present. Operation Lazarus, deep cover missions, the survival of Phoenix Squadron's commander, the pieces painted a picture of complexity that extended far beyond routine pilot training. The confrontation was building toward a climax that would change everything, but it was interrupted by an event that no one could have anticipated. The base's emergency alarm system suddenly came to life, its harsh tones cutting through the tense standoff like a blade. All personnel, this is base security. The voice over the public address system was tight with urgency. We have multiple aircraft approaching from the south. Unknown configuration, unknown intent, all pilots to immediate alert status. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Every person on the tarmac forgot about Skylar's identity, the special operations team, and the mystery of Operation Lazarus. Training and instinct took over as pilots and crew members scattered to their emergency stations. But Skylar's reaction was different from everyone else's. Instead of confusion or concern, her expression showed recognition, as if she'd been expecting this moment for a very long time. When she spoke, her words carried the calm authority of someone taking command of a situation she understood better than anyone else. "Tom," she called out to Master Sergeant Richardson, "I need a bird ready for immediate launch. Full combat load, external tanks, the works." Richardson didn't hesitate, his decades of experience telling him that arguing with Phoenix in crisis mode was futile. Hangar 3 has a hot bird on standby, takes 5 minutes to prep for launch. But Colonel Ironclad wasn't ready to surrender his command authority, regardless of who Skylar might really be. "Captain, you are not authorized for combat operations. Stand down immediately." Skylar turned to face him, and for the first time since arriving at Falcon Ridge, her mask of careful anonymity slipped completely. The woman who looked back at Ironclad wasn't a disabled rookie, or even a highly skilled pilot. She was something else entirely, a warrior whose reputation had been forged in the deadliest skies on Earth. "Colonel," she said, her voice carrying quiet authority that demanded attention, "those aircraft approaching from the south are part of Operation Lazarus. They're here for me, and they're not going to stop until either I'm dead or they are." The words hit the assembled group like a physical blow, revealing the true scope of what they'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about a pilot's hidden identity. It was about unfinished business from a classified operation that had supposedly ended 5 years ago. As air raid sirens began to wail across Falcon Ridge Air Force Base, everyone present understood that they were about to witness the next chapter in a story that had been written in blood and secrecy, a story whose final page had yet to be written. The morning that had begun with mockery and humiliation was about to become something else entirely, a test of skill and courage that would determine not just Skylar's fate, but the safety of everyone on the base. The approaching aircraft materialized out of the desert haze like harbingers of death, their sleek profiles cutting through the Nevada sky with predatory grace. Riley Martinez, still reeling from his discovery of Skylar's true identity, found himself pressed against the operations building wall as chaos erupted around him. 6 aircraft, bearing 180 degrees, altitude angels 15 and descending, the tower controller's voice crackled, with barely controlled panic over the base-wide frequency. Configuration appears to be modified F-35 Lightning IIs, but they're not squawking friendly codes. Modified F-35s appearing without authorization over a classified training facility sent ice through the veins of every pilot present. Those aircraft represented cutting-edge technology that shouldn't exist outside of highly controlled environments. And their presence here suggested either a catastrophic security breach or something far more sinister. Skylar stood motionless in the center of the chaos, her damaged hand resting on her hip, while her good hand unconsciously reached for the wing tattoo at her neck. The gesture was subtle, but Master Sergeant Richardson caught it, the same nervous habit she'd displayed before every high-risk mission in Syria. "Phoenix," Richardson called out over the growing noise. "What aren't you telling us? Those birds aren't Air Force standard configuration." The Special Operations team leader stepped closer to Skylar, his gray eyes scanning the approaching aircraft with professional assessment. "Captain, we need to implement extraction protocols immediately. The situation has escalated beyond acceptable parameters." But Skylar's attention was focused on something else entirely. She was listening to a frequency that others couldn't hear, her head tilted slightly, as if receiving information through channels unavailable to standard military communications. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of terrible certainty. "They're not here to extract anyone," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the ambient noise with chilling clarity. "They're here to finish what they started 5 years ago." Colonel Ironclad, his command training finally overriding his confusion about Skylar's identity, began issuing rapid orders to his staff. "I want every available aircraft armed and ready for launch in 15 minutes. Scramble alert fighters from Nellis. Get me a direct line to NORAD immediately." But even as he spoke, everyone present understood that 15 minutes might as well be 15 hours. The approaching aircraft were less than 5 minutes out, and their intentions were becoming clearer with each passing second. Make sure you're subscribed because the next video reveals what happened to Skylar after this mission. And trust me, her story is far from over. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these incredible tales of hidden heroes. Riley Martinez found himself caught between terror and fascination as events unfolded around him. His academic knowledge of military history was colliding with real-world implications in ways that textbooks never prepared students for. The Phoenix Squadron Memorial at the Air Force Academy suddenly took on new meaning, not just a tribute to fallen heroes, but a carefully constructed cover story for something much more complex. "Operation Lazarus," he whispered to himself, the pieces clicking together with devastating clarity. It wasn't about resurrection, it was about concealment. The young cadet's words reached Skylar's ears despite the growing chaos, and she turned to look at him with something that might have been approval. "Very good, Mr. Martinez. Most people never make that connection." Her acknowledgement sent chills down Riley's spine. Here was confirmation from the source herself that everything he'd studied about Phoenix Squadron was carefully crafted deception. But before he could process the implications further, the situation took another dramatic turn. The lead aircraft in the approaching formation began broadcasting on the standard emergency frequency, its transmission reaching every radio on the base simultaneously. The voice that emerged from the speakers was cultured, educated, and absolutely cold. "Falcon Ridge Air Force Base, this is Colonel Marcus Blackwood, formerly of Phoenix Squadron. You are harboring a war criminal and traitor to the United States Air Force. Surrender Captain Sarah Thorne immediately, or face the consequences of protecting an enemy of the state." The transmission hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. War criminal, traitor, enemy of the state. The accusations were so far removed from everything they thought that they knew about Phoenix Squadron that several people actually laughed, assuming they had heard incorrectly. But Skylar's reaction told a different story. Her face had gone pale beneath her tan, and her damaged hand was trembling in a way that had nothing to do with her physical injuries. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of old pain and terrible knowledge. "Marcus survived," she said, the words barely above a whisper. "I thought he was dead. I saw his aircraft go down over Aleppo." The Special Operations Team leader stepped protectively closer to Skylar, his hand moving unconsciously toward the concealed weapon beneath his civilian jacket. "Captain, we need immediate extraction. This situation has moved beyond our contingency planning." But Skylar was already moving toward the hangar, where Richardson had promised a combat-ready aircraft. Her stride was purposeful, determined, carrying the unmistakable bearing of someone who had made a decision that couldn't be reversed. "Negative," she called back over her shoulder. "Marcus isn't here for extraction or negotiation. He's here to finish what he started in Syria. And he won't stop until one of us is dead." Her words painted a picture that went far beyond simple military operations. This was personal, a vendetta that had been 5 years in the making, finally coming to its inevitable conclusion above the Nevada desert. Commander Hawthorne, still struggling with the humiliation of his aerial defeat, found himself caught between wounded pride and genuine concern for base safety. Despite everything that had happened, his training as a military officer demanded that he take action to protect his people. "Ironclad," he called out to the colonel, "whatever's happening here is above our pay grade, but those aircraft represent a clear threat to base personnel. We need to get civilians to safety and prepare for potential combat operations." It was the first sensible thing Hawthorne had said all day, and Colonel Ironclad immediately began implementing evacuation protocols. But even as personnel scattered toward hardened shelters, everyone understood that concrete and steel would provide little protection against the advanced weapons systems carried by modified F-35s. The approaching aircraft were now visible to the naked eye, their swept wing profiles gleaming in the harsh desert sun. As they drew closer, details became apparent that made the situation even more ominous. These weren't standard Lightning IIs. They'd been modified with external hardpoints carrying weapons that didn't appear in any public military inventory. Skylar reached the hangar and immediately began her pre-flight inspection of the waiting F-16, her movements flowing with the same deadly efficiency she'd displayed during the training exercise. But this time, there was an urgency to her actions that spoke of genuine life-or-death stakes. "Tom," she called out to Richardson, "I need external fuel tanks and every air-to-air missile this bird can carry. This isn't going to be a short engagement." Richardson and his crew moved with practiced efficiency, their years of experience allowing them to prep the aircraft for combat operations in record time. But even as they worked, everyone present understood that a single F-16, regardless of the pilot's skill, faced overwhelming odds against 6 advanced stealth fighters. Riley Martinez found himself drawn toward the hangar, despite every instinct telling him to seek shelter. Something about the unfolding situation demanded witness, required documentation for a story that he was beginning to understand might never make it into official records. "Captain Thorne," he called out, as Skylar continued her inspection, "what really happened during Operation Lazarus? Why is Colonel Blackwood calling you a traitor?" Skylar paused in her pre-flight routine, her hazel eyes meeting Riley's with an intensity that made him step back involuntarily. For a moment, he saw not the disabled pilot who'd been mocked that morning, but the warrior who'd earned her reputation in the deadliest skies on Earth. "Operation Lazarus was supposed to be a simple tactical strike," she said, her voice carrying the weight of old memories and fresh pain. "Intelligence indicated a high-value target in a Syrian facility, chemical weapons research that threatened civilian populations across the region." She returned to her inspection, but continued talking as she worked. "What we found instead was evidence of American involvement in those chemical weapons programs. Classified contracts, funding streams, personnel assignments, everything needed to prove that certain elements within our own government were complicit in war crimes." The revelation hit Riley like a physical blow. Chemical weapons, American complicity, war crimes. The implications went far beyond military operations into the realm of international law and political conspiracy. "Marcus wanted to bury the evidence," Skylar continued, her voice growing harder with each word. "Said it was above our pay grade, that revealing the truth would damage national security, but I'd seen the casualty reports from those chemical attacks. Thousands of civilians, including children." She straightened up from the aircraft, her expression showing the kind of moral certainty that made heroes and martyrs in equal measure. "I couldn't let that stand. So I copied the files and transmitted them to oversight authorities in Washington. Marcus and 3 other squadron members tried to stop me. The picture was becoming clearer, but it painted Skylar not as a traitor, but as someone who'd chosen conscience over convenience, morality over military hierarchy. The Phoenix Squadron Memorial at the Air Force Academy suddenly took on even more complex meaning. Not just concealment, but perhaps protection for someone who'd done the right thing at tremendous personal cost. The radio crackled to life again, Colonel Blackwood's voice carrying a new edge of impatience. "Captain Thorne, you have 30 seconds to surrender yourself for military justice, or we will consider all personnel on this base to be enemy combatants." The threat was clear and immediate. 30 seconds to choose between personal safety and the lives of hundreds of innocent people. It was exactly the kind of impossible decision that had defined Skylar's career and led to her current situation. Colonel Ironclad's voice boomed across the hangar, carrying the authority of command despite the chaos surrounding them. "Captain Thorne, regardless of your identity or mission status, I cannot authorize you to engage 6 advanced fighters in single combat. It's suicide." But Skylar was already climbing into the cockpit, her damaged hands somehow managing the complex sequence of switches and controls required to bring the F-16 to life. When she spoke, her voice carried over the growing engine noise with absolute certainty. "Colonel, with respect, this stopped being about military authorization the moment Marcus decided to silence witnesses rather than face accountability for war crimes. This is about justice, and justice doesn't recognize rank or authority." The F-16's engines spooled up to full power, the sound drowning out further conversation. But through the cockpit glass, everyone could see Skylar's lips moving as she spoke into her radio, presumably communicating with the approaching threat on a frequency that others couldn't monitor. Riley Martinez found himself running toward the aircraft despite the danger, driven by an academic's need to understand the complete story. As he reached the cockpit, Skylar noticed him and opened her canopy slightly. "Tell them the truth," she called down to him, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Tell them what Phoenix Squadron really died for, and why some ghosts refused to stay buried." Before Riley could respond, the canopy slammed shut, and the F-16 began rolling toward the runway. Within seconds, it was airborne, climbing rapidly toward an appointment with destiny that had been 5 years in the making. The 6 modified F-35s had formed a combat spread, their position suggesting tactics designed to overwhelm a single opponent through coordinated attacks. But as Skylar's aircraft climbed to meet them, something unexpected happened that changed the entire dynamic of the engagement. The Special Operations Team leader, who had been standing silently beside his helicopter, suddenly began issuing rapid orders into a secure communication device. Within minutes, additional aircraft began appearing on the horizon, not the slow response of scrambled alert fighters, but the immediate arrival of assets that had been pre-positioned for exactly this contingency. "This is Phoenix Actual," a new voice announced over the emergency frequency. "We have multiple friendlies inbound to support Lazarus 773. All Falcon Ridge personnel maintain safe distance and observe. Phoenix Actual." The call sign that had supposedly died with Phoenix Squadron 5 years ago, now announcing the arrival of support that shouldn't exist. The implications were staggering. Operation Lazarus hadn't ended in Syria, it had continued in secret, with resources and personnel that operated outside normal military channels. 6 F-22 Raptors materialized out of the desert sky like avenging angels, their stealth capabilities allowing them to appear without warning, despite the sophisticated sensors monitoring Nevada airspace. But these weren't standard Air Force aircraft. They bore no unit markings, no identification numbers, nothing that could trace them to official sources. The arrival of the Raptors transformed the tactical situation from hopeless to merely desperate. Skylar was no longer facing 6-to-1 odds, but the modified F-35s still represented a significant threat, especially with their unknown weapons capabilities. High above the Nevada desert, a battle was about to begin that would determine not just the fate of those involved, but the future of accountability within the American military. The truth about Operation Lazarus, chemical weapons programs, and the price of moral courage was finally going to be settled in the most definitive way possible. As the opposing forces closed to engagement range, everyone on the ground understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a confrontation between different visions of duty, honor, and the cost of doing what's right when the consequences are measured in blood. The first shots of the engagement were fired by Colonel Blackwood's formation, their modified F-35s launching missiles that streaked across the desert sky like harbingers of judgment. But Skylar was ready, her aircraft dancing through the incoming fire with the same supernatural grace she'd displayed during the morning's training exercise. "Falcon 773, break right and extend," Phoenix Actual's voice crackled over the radio, coordinating the defensive response with professional precision. "Raptor flight is engaging from the north." The F-22s swept into the battle like wolves among sheep, their advanced stealth capabilities and superior maneuverability allowing them to engage Blackwood's formation from multiple angles simultaneously. What had seemed like overwhelming odds suddenly became a more even fight, with skill and technology balancing against numbers and surprise. But Colonel Blackwood wasn't finished. His transmission over the emergency frequency carried a new threat that made everyone on the ground freeze with horror. If Captain Thorne won't surrender voluntarily, then perhaps the destruction of this base will motivate her to reconsider. "Phoenix 773, you have 60 seconds to land and surrender, or we begin targeting ground installations." The threat was clear and immediate. Blackwood was prepared to kill hundreds of innocent people to achieve his objective of silencing the last witness to Phoenix Squadron's discoveries in Syria. It was exactly the kind of escalation that transformed military engagement into something approaching terrorism. Skylar's response came immediately, her voice carrying across the radio frequencies with the kind of cold fury that made veteran pilots instinctively check their 6 o'clock positions. "Marcus, you always were a coward. In Syria, you were willing to let chemical weapons kill civilians to protect your career. Now you're threatening American airmen to cover up your complicity. Some things never change." Her words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Whatever relationship had existed between Skylar and Blackwood before Operation Lazarus, it was now poisoned by 5 years of betrayal and the knowledge that principles had been abandoned for convenience. The aerial battle intensified as more aircraft joined the engagement. The F-22s proved their superiority in beyond visual range combat, their advanced radar and missile systems allowing them to engage Blackwood's formation from distances that made retaliation difficult. But the modified F-35s carried weapons that defied easy categorization, launching countermeasures that suggested access to experimental technology. On the ground, Riley Martinez found himself pressed against the hangar wall, his academic mind struggling to process the reality of modern aerial combat. The speeds involved, the distances covered, the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Everything was happening too fast for human comprehension. But through it all, one aircraft stood out from the rest. Skylar's F-16, despite being outclassed by every other fighter in the engagement, somehow managed to not just survive, but actively contribute to the battle. Her tactics were unlike anything in standard Air Force doctrine, incorporating maneuvers that seemed to bend the laws of physics. "Holy cow," Chief Master Sergeant Dalton breathed, watching the tracking displays with the fascination of someone who'd spent his entire career around fighter aircraft. "She's flying that Falcon like it's part of her body. I've never seen anything like it." Master Sergeant Richardson nodded grimly, his memories of Syria providing context that others lacked. Phoenix always flew different from everyone else. Like she could see the battle 3 moves ahead, knew what the enemy was going to do before they did it. The engagement was entering its most critical phase when something unexpected happened that changed everything. One of Blackwood's F-35s, damaged by Raptor fire and leaking fuel, began heading directly toward the base in what looked like either an emergency landing attempt or a deliberate ramming attack. Skylar saw the threat immediately and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Abandoning her own engagement, she dove toward the damaged F-35, placing her aircraft between the threat and the base full of innocent people. "All ground personnel take cover immediately," she broadcast on the emergency frequency, her voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. Incoming aircraft is not under control. What followed was a masterclass in defensive flying, as Skylar used her F-16 to shepherd the damaged F-35 away from populated areas through a combination of aggressive maneuvering and carefully placed warning shots. It was the kind of flying that required split-second timing and absolute confidence, mistakes measured in civilian casualties rather than training scores. The damaged F-35 finally crashed in the desert 3 miles from the base, its pilot ejecting successfully, but the aircraft creating a fireball that could be seen for dozens of miles. Skylar's intervention had saved hundreds of lives, but at the cost of exposing herself to attack from the remaining enemy aircraft. Colonel Blackwood seized the opportunity, directing his remaining fighters to concentrate their fire on Skylar's isolated F-16. What followed was a desperate running battle across the Nevada desert, with one pilot against multiple opponents in a contest that seemed to have only one possible outcome. But Skylar had spent 5 years preparing for this moment, and her F-16 carried modifications that weren't apparent from external inspection. When Blackwood's formation closed for the kill, they discovered that reports of her death had been greatly exaggerated. The countermeasures suite in Skylar's aircraft was unlike anything in standard Air Force inventory, combining electronic warfare capabilities with kinetic defenses that turned incoming missiles into elaborate fireworks displays. But more importantly, her tactical approach incorporated lessons learned from 5 years of hiding in plain sight, using deception and misdirection as force multipliers. Phoenix 773, this is Raptor Lead, the radio crackled with urgent coordination traffic. We're Winchester on long-range missiles. Closing for guns engagement. Winchester, out of ammunition. The F-22s had expended their beyond visual range weapons and were transitioning to close-range combat, where their stealth advantages would be reduced and their vulnerability to the F-35's unknown capabilities would increase dramatically. But Skylar had one more card to play, a tactical innovation that she'd been developing during her years of exile. Instead of engaging Blackwood's remaining aircraft directly, she began a complex series of maneuvers designed to draw them into a carefully prepared trap. The Nevada desert was home to numerous military installations, including ranges where experimental weapons were tested under highly controlled conditions. Skylar's flight path wasn't random. It was leading Blackwood's formation directly over one of those ranges, where defensive systems designed to protect classified research could be activated remotely. Phoenix Actual, this is Lazarus 773, she transmitted on a secure frequency, requesting immediate activation of Groom Lake defensive protocols, authorization Phoenix 7737. The response came immediately, confirming that her authorization codes were valid and that defensive systems were coming online. What Blackwood didn't know was that he was about to encounter the most advanced air defense network in the world, one designed to protect secrets so sensitive that their existence was denied by multiple government agencies. The first indication that something had changed came when Blackwood's formation began experiencing electronic interference that degraded their sensors and communications. The modified F-35s, for all their advanced capabilities, weren't designed to operate in the kind of electromagnetic environment that surrounded Area 51 and its associated facilities. "What's happening to our systems?" one of Blackwood's pilots transmitted, his voice tight with concern as his aircraft's displays began showing conflicting information. But before Blackwood could respond, the desert floor erupted with the launch signatures of surface-to-air missiles that weren't supposed to exist. The defensive systems protecting Groom Lake included weapons that had never been publicly acknowledged, capabilities that redefined what was possible in modern air defense. The battle's conclusion was swift and decisive. Blackwood's remaining aircraft, blinded by electronic countermeasures and overwhelmed by defensive fire, were systematically eliminated with a precision that spoke of decades of technological development. Only Blackwood himself managed to eject successfully, his aircraft destroyed by weapons that would never appear in any official record. As the smoke cleared and the defensive systems powered down, Skylar's F-16 remained alone in the Nevada sky, its pilot having survived against impossible odds through a combination of skill, preparation, and access to resources that existed outside normal military channels. The landing at Falcon Ridge was unlike anything in the base's history. As Skylar's aircraft touched down, every person present understood that they'd witnessed something that would never make it into official records. A battle that had been fought over principles that transcended military hierarchy and national boundaries. Colonel Ironclad was waiting on the tarmac as Skylar climbed out of her cockpit, his expression showing the kind of uncertainty that came from having his understanding of military operations completely rewritten in the span of an hour. "Captain Thorne," he began, then stopped, uncertain how to address someone whose official status was apparently so classified that even her existence was disputed. "I think we need to have a conversation about what just happened here." But Skylar's attention was focused on the horizon, where the Special Operations Team's helicopter was preparing for immediate departure. The battle might be over, but the larger conflict that had defined her life for 5 years was far from resolved. "Colonel," she said quietly, "what happened here today was the conclusion of Operation Lazarus. Marcus Blackwood was the last loose end, the final threat to the evidence that Phoenix Squadron died to protect." She turned to face him, her hazel eyes showing a weariness that spoke of years spent carrying burdens that should have been shared by others. The chemical weapons programs we uncovered in Syria were shut down because of the information I transmitted to Washington. Thousands of lives were saved, but the cost was everything Phoenix Squadron believed in. Riley Martinez, who'd been listening from a respectful distance, finally found his voice. What happens now? Do you go back into hiding, continue the deep cover mission? Skylar's smile was sad but genuine, carrying a peace that hadn't been present in her expression since arriving at Falcon Ridge. Mr. Martinez, there's no mission left to complete. The truth about Operation Lazarus is going to come out, and when it does, the world will understand what Phoenix Squadron really accomplished. The Special Operations Team leader approached, his gray eyes showing a respect that hadn't been present during their earlier confrontation. Captain, we're ready for extraction whenever you give the word. But Skylar shook her head, her decision made with the same certainty that had defined every critical moment of her career. Negative, I'm not running anymore. It's time for Sarah Phoenix Thorne to come back from the dead officially. Her words carried implications that went far beyond personal survival. If she emerged from deep cover voluntarily, if she testified about Operation Lazarus and the discoveries that had cost Phoenix Squadron their lives, the resulting investigations would reshape how the American military approached accountability and moral courage. Colonel Ironclad stepped forward, his command training providing structure for a situation that defied normal procedures. Captain, if you're requesting asylum or protection, I can guarantee your safety while proper authorities are contacted. That won't be necessary, a new voice interrupted from behind them. The man approaching was unremarkable in appearance, wearing the kind of civilian clothes that made him effectively invisible in most crowds. But his voice carried authority that made career officers instinctively straighten their postures. Deputy Director Harrison, CIA, he introduced himself, producing credentials that Colonel Ironclad examined with growing amazement. Captain Thorne has been operating under our joint authority for the past 5 years. Her mission status is being upgraded from classified to congressional oversight as of this moment. The arrival of CIA authority transformed the situation once again, but this time in ways that promised resolution rather than further conflict. Harrison's presence meant that Skylar's story would receive the kind of high-level attention that could ensure both justice and protection. Director, Skylar acknowledged, her posture showing the kind of relief that came from knowing that 5 years of solitary burden was finally being shared. Is the Oversight Committee ready for full disclosure? Harrison nodded grimly, his expression showing the weight of secrets that were about to become public knowledge. Congress has been briefed on the existence of Operation Lazarus and its ongoing implications. Your testimony will be classified, but the resulting investigations will be very public indeed. Riley Martinez found himself witnessing history in the making, the moment when carefully hidden truths began their inevitable journey into public consciousness. His academic mind was already racing ahead to the implications, the textbooks that would need to be rewritten, the memorial walls that would require new names. Captain, he called out, when the truth comes out, what do you want people to remember about Phoenix Squadron? Skylar considered the question for a long moment, her gaze moving across the assembled faces of pilots and crew members who'd been unwitting witnesses to one of the most significant military operations of the decade. I want them to remember that Phoenix Squadron chose conscience over convenience, she said finally. We could have followed orders, kept quiet, let chemical weapons continue killing civilians because investigating would have been inconvenient for our careers. She paused, her damaged hand unconsciously reaching for the wing tattoo that had revealed her identity. Instead, we chose to do what was right, regardless of the personal cost. 5 of my squadron mates died to protect evidence that saved thousands of lives. That's what I want people to remember. Her words carried across the tarmac with the weight of absolute truth, creating a moment of silence that felt almost sacred. Everyone present understood that they'd witnessed something extraordinary, not just a military engagement, but a demonstration of the principles that made service meaningful. Commander Hawthorne, who had spent the entire day struggling with his own relationship to military honor, finally found words that expressed what many were feeling. Captain, I owe you an apology that I can never adequately make. What I saw today, the flying, the sacrifice, the courage, it's humbling. He straightened to attention, rendering a salute that carried genuine respect rather than mere protocol. Permission to serve under your command in whatever capacity you'll accept, ma'am. The offer was echoed by other pilots and crew members, their earlier mockery transformed into something approaching reverence. They'd seen Sarah Phoenix Thorne return from the dead, not for revenge or personal gain, but to finish protecting people who would never know her name. But Skylar's response surprised everyone present, showing a humility that was the final piece of her extraordinary character. "Commander, the only command I want is a classroom full of young pilots who understand that technical skill without moral courage is meaningless," she said. "If Falcon Ridge will have me, I'd like to teach the next generation that doing what's right is more important than doing what's easy." The transformation from combat legend to instructor represented the kind of service that rarely received public recognition but formed the backbone of military excellence. Skylar wasn't seeking glory or vindication. She wanted to ensure that future pilots would be prepared to make the same difficult choices that had defined Operation Lazarus. Colonel Ironclad stepped forward, his decision made with the certainty of someone who recognized an opportunity to improve his command in ways that couldn't be measured by standard metrics. "Captain Thorne, I would be honored to offer you a permanent position at Falcon Ridge, Chief Instructor for Combat Ethics and Tactical Decision-Making." The position would allow Skylar to remain in the shadows while ensuring that her hard-won knowledge would be passed to the next generation of American pilots. It was exactly the kind of resolution that honored both her need for relative anonymity and the military's requirement for institutional knowledge preservation. As the crowd began to disperse and normal base operations slowly resumed, Riley Martinez lingered near Skylar, his academic curiosity demanding one final question. "Captain, why did you reveal yourself today? You could have maintained your cover, continued the mission in secret." Skylar's answer was simple but profound, carrying the wisdom of someone who'd learned the true cost of secrecy and the ultimate value of truth. "Mr. Martinez, secrets are like cancer. They grow stronger in darkness and weaker in light. Operation Lazarus accomplished its objectives, but the price was isolation and deception. It's time for the truth to see daylight, regardless of the consequences." She looked around the base that would become her new home, her expression showing peace for the first time since arriving at Falcon Ridge. "Besides, someone needs to make sure that future Phoenix squadrons don't have to choose between duty and conscience. Maybe that someone is me." As the sun set over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that matched the fire that had defined her career, Sarah Phoenix Thorne prepared to begin the next chapter of her extraordinary life. The ghost of Phoenix Squadron was finally ready to come home. The advanced pilot certification programs utilizing virtual reality training systems enabled rapid skill assessment and accelerated learning curves for specialized military aviation roles. These intensive courses combined classroom instruction with cutting-edge flight simulation technology, providing comprehensive education pathways for elite pilot development with guaranteed placement opportunities in specialized units. 6 months later, the Falcon Ridge Air Force Base bore only superficial resemblance to the installation that had witnessed the return of Phoenix Squadron's commanding officer. The changes weren't architectural. The same runways, hangars, and operations buildings remained. But the culture had been transformed by the presence of someone who'd proven that moral courage could survive even the most challenging circumstances. Captain Sarah Phoenix Thorne's classroom was located in Building 7, a nondescript structure that had been hastily converted to accommodate the new combat ethics and decision-making curriculum. The room itself was unremarkable. Standard Air Force institutional furniture, motivational posters that had seen better days, and a whiteboard that had been scarred by countless briefings. But the woman standing at the front of the classroom was anything but unremarkable. 6 months of regular sleep, proper nutrition, and the relief of no longer carrying secrets alone had transformed Skylar's appearance dramatically. Her neon blue hair had grown out to reveal natural auburn beneath, and the constant tension that had marked her features during those first days at Falcon Ridge had been replaced by something approaching contentment. Her right hand still bore the scars that had drawn so much mockery, but the tremor had largely disappeared. The specialized therapy available to deep cover operatives had worked wonders, though she still wore the adaptive gloves that had become her trademark among the pilot community. "Ladies and gentlemen," she addressed the room full of young pilots, her voice carrying the authority that came from combat experience rather than rank structure. "Today we're going to discuss the most difficult decision any military officer will ever face. What to do when duty and conscience collide." The 20 pilots in her class represented the cream of Air Force talent, graduates of the Academy and ROTC programs who'd proven themselves in initial flight training. They sat at attention, notebooks ready, hanging on every word from an instructor whose reputation had grown to mythical proportions throughout the Air Force. Riley Martinez, now a second lieutenant and among the youngest members of the class, occupied the front row seat he'd claimed on the first day of instruction. His hero worship of Phoenix had evolved into something more mature, a deep respect for someone who'd paid an extraordinary price for doing what was right. "Who can tell me the difference between legal orders and moral orders?" Skylar asked, her gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. A hand shot up in the back row. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, an Academy graduate whose academic record was nearly perfect. "Ma'am, legal orders are those issued by competent authority within the chain of command. Moral orders are those that align with ethical principles and the values of the service." Skylar nodded approvingly, but her expression suggested that the answer was incomplete. "Excellent, Lieutenant Walsh. But what happens when legal orders conflict with moral obligations? What happens when competent authority directs you to take actions that violate the core principles that brought you into military service?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing the young pilots to grapple with complexities that their previous training had only touched upon. Most military education focused on following orders, accomplishing missions, and supporting the chain of command. Skylar's curriculum delved into the uncomfortable areas where those principles created ethical dilemmas. Lieutenant Marcus Stone, a pilot whose family had served in the Air Force for 3 generations, raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, isn't the assumption that legal orders from competent authority are inherently moral? Shouldn't we trust that our superiors have information we don't, perspectives that justify their decisions?" It was exactly the kind of question that Skylar had been expecting, the logical response from someone raised in military culture, where authority was rarely questioned. Her answer carried the weight of hard-won experience and painful personal knowledge. "Lieutenant Stone, that assumption is exactly what Operation Lazarus was designed to test. Sometimes competent authority is compromised by political pressure, personal ambition, or simple moral cowardice. Sometimes the information that superiors possess is designed to justify actions that can't be justified by any ethical standard." She moved to the whiteboard and began writing names and dates, creating a timeline that her students recognized as the official account of Phoenix Squadron's final mission. But as she wrote, she added details that weren't present in any public record, information that painted a very different picture of what had actually occurred. Phoenix Squadron received orders to conduct a precision strike on a Syrian facility suspected of housing chemical weapons research. The intelligence was solid, the target was legitimate, and the mission parameters were well within standard Air Force capabilities. She paused, her marker hovering over the board, as memories that were still painful after 5 years demanded acknowledgement. What we found at the target site was evidence that those chemical weapons had been developed with American assistance, using funding streams that originated in classified congressional appropriations. The room had gone completely silent, the young pilots beginning to understand that they were receiving information that went far beyond standard ethics instruction. This was personal testimony from someone who'd lived through the kind of moral crisis that most people only encountered in theoretical discussions. "My squadron commander, Colonel Marcus Blackwood, ordered us to destroy the evidence and report the mission as a simple tactical strike. He argued that revealing American complicity would damage national security, undermine ongoing operations, and destroy careers of people who were simply following orders." Lieutenant Walsh raised her hand again, her voice showing the kind of uncertainty that came from having fundamental assumptions challenged. "Ma'am, wasn't he right? Wouldn't revealing that information have caused more harm than good?" Skylar's smile was sad but understanding, recognizing the struggle of someone grappling with complex moral terrain for the first time. "Lieutenant, that's exactly the argument he made. And it's exactly the argument that's been used to justify cover-ups throughout military history." She turned back to the whiteboard and began adding new information: casualty reports from chemical weapons attacks, intelligence estimates of civilian deaths, photographs of children who had been killed by weapons developed with American assistance. "The question isn't whether revealing the truth would cause damage," she continued, her voice growing harder with each word. "The question is whether we're willing to let that damage continue accumulating while we protect ourselves from the consequences of our complicity." The classroom had become a confessional, with Schuyler revealing details about Operation Lazarus that had never appeared in any official record. Her students were getting a masterclass in military ethics from someone who'd paid the ultimate price for choosing principle over convenience. Riley Martinez finally found the courage to ask the question that everyone was thinking. "Ma'am, what did you do when Colonel Blackwood ordered you to destroy the evidence?" Schuyler's answer was delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who'd made peace with decisions that had cost her everything she'd once valued. "I copied the files and transmitted them to oversight authorities in Washington. Then I prepared for the consequences, which I knew would be severe and immediate." She described the firefight that had followed, the desperate battle over Syrian airspace as Blackwood and 3 other squadron members attempted to silence the only witness to their conspiracy. The official records listed Phoenix Squadron as killed in action during a classified operation, but the truth was that they died fighting each other over evidence that could prevent thousands of civilian deaths. Only Lieutenant Sarah Phoenix Thorne survived that engagement, Schuyler concluded, and only because she ejected over friendly territory and was rescued by Special Operations Forces who understood the significance of what she'd discovered. The revelation that their instructor was officially dead, that Sarah Phoenix Thorne existed only as a name on a memorial wall, sent shockwaves through the classroom. Everything they thought they knew about military service, about heroism and sacrifice, was being rewritten by someone who'd lived through the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Lieutenant Stone asked the question that was echoing in everyone's mind. "Ma'am, was it worth it? Was saving those civilians worth destroying Phoenix Squadron, worth 5 years of hiding, worth everything you've lost?" Schuyler's answer came without hesitation, carrying the absolute certainty of someone who'd had years to consider the alternatives. "Lieutenant, every night for 5 years I've gone to sleep, knowing that chemical weapons programs were shut down because Phoenix Squadron chose conscience over convenience. Every morning I've woken up knowing that children are alive, because we refused to protect the careers of people who valued secrecy over accountability." She looked around the classroom, meeting the eyes of each student in turn. Would I make the same choice again, knowing the cost? Yes, without hesitation. Because that's what service means, protecting people who can't protect themselves, regardless of the personal consequences. The lesson that followed was unlike anything in standard military curriculum. Schuyler presented case studies from throughout military history, examples of officers who'd faced similar moral crises and the various ways they'd responded. Some had chosen obedience and lived with the consequences. Others had chosen resistance and paid extraordinary prices. But the common thread through every example was that the decision to act on moral principle required accepting personal costs that most people couldn't imagine. Careers destroyed, relationships ended, futures sacrificed, the price of maintaining integrity in a world that often rewarded compromise. "The question you'll face as officers," Schuyler told her students, "isn't whether you'll encounter situations where duty and conscience collide. You will. The question is whether you will have the courage to do what's right when that moment comes." As the class session ended and students filed out with expressions showing deep contemplation, Riley Martinez lingered behind. His relationship with Schuyler had evolved over the months from hero worship to something approaching friendship, though the gap in their experience and knowledge remained vast. "Captain," he said, using the title she'd insisted upon despite her official status remaining classified, "do you think teaching is enough? Are you satisfied with passing on lessons instead of continuing to fight actively?" Schuyler's response showed the kind of wisdom that came from understanding the true nature of service and the various forms it could take. "Riley, every pilot who leaves this classroom with a better understanding of moral courage is a victory for everything Phoenix Squadron died to protect. Every officer who chooses principle over convenience because they remember these lessons is a continuation of the mission that started in Syria." She began erasing the whiteboard, removing the evidence of the day's instruction, just as she'd once hidden evidence of chemical weapons programs. But this time, the knowledge wasn't being suppressed. It was being transmitted to people who would carry it forward into their own moments of moral crisis. "Besides," she added with a smile that carried genuine contentment, "Phoenix Squadron was never about one person or one mission. It was about the idea that some principles are worth any sacrifice. As long as that idea continues to influence young officers, Phoenix Squadron is immortal." The months that followed Schuyler's arrival at Falcon Ridge had seen changes that extended far beyond the base itself. Word of her teaching methods had spread throughout the Air Force, generating requests for her curriculum to be adopted at other installations. The Combat Ethics and Decision-Making program was being studied by military educators worldwide as a model for preparing officers to handle the moral complexities of modern warfare. But perhaps more importantly, the investigation triggered by her emergence from deep cover was beginning to bear fruit. Congressional oversight committees had launched inquiries into classified defense contracts, chemical weapons research, and the accountability mechanisms designed to prevent American complicity in war crimes. Colonel Marcus Blackwood, the sole survivor of the aerial engagement over Nevada, was facing courts-martial proceedings that it would determine whether his actions constituted treason, insubordination, or justified protection of classified information. The trial was closed to the public, but its implications were reverberating throughout the defense establishment. Deputy Director Harrison of the CIA had become a regular visitor to Falcon Ridge, consulting with Schuyler on ongoing investigations and the development of new protocols for handling moral crises within the intelligence community. Their conversations were classified, but the results were becoming apparent in policy changes throughout the government. "Captain," Harrison said during one of their monthly meetings, "the Phoenix Squadron protocols are being implemented across all Special Operations commands. Your curriculum is becoming mandatory reading for senior officers in positions where moral crises are most likely to occur. The Phoenix Squadron protocols, guidelines for handling situations where duty and conscience collided, developed from Schuyler's hard-won experience and the lessons of Operation Lazarus. They represented the first systematic attempt to institutionalize moral courage within the American military, creating structures that would support officers who found themselves facing the same impossible choices that had defined Phoenix Squadron's final mission." But Schuyler's greatest satisfaction came not from policy changes or institutional recognition, but from the letters she received from former students who'd taken her lessons into their own assignments. Young officers writing from deployments around the world, describing moments when they'd chosen principle over convenience because they remembered discussions in Building 7 at Falcon Ridge. One letter, from Lieutenant Walsh, who was now serving in Afghanistan, particularly moved her. "Captain Thorne, last week I was ordered to authorize a strike on a facility that intelligence indicated contained enemy combatants, but my own reconnaissance showed civilian vehicles in the area, children playing in nearby buildings. I remembered your lessons about the cost of moral compromise and refused to authorize the strike without additional confirmation. It took 6 hours to get proper intelligence, but we ultimately discovered that the facility was being used as a school. Phoenix Squadron's legacy saved those children, just as it saved children in Syria 5 years ago. Letters like Walsh's arrived weekly, each one confirming that Schuyler's decision to emerge from deep cover and share her experiences was producing the kind of results that couldn't be measured by standard military metrics. Phoenix Squadron's mission was continuing through the actions of officers who understood that true service sometimes required saying no to authority. The memorial wall at the Air Force Academy had been quietly updated to reflect new information about Phoenix Squadron's final mission. The official records still classified most details, but the memorial now acknowledged that the squadron had died protecting civilians rather than in a simple tactical operation. It was a small change, but one that honored the truth of their sacrifice. Riley Martinez had graduated from Schuyler's program and received assignment to an F-22 squadron at Langley Air Force Base. But before departing Falcon Ridge, he'd spent weeks helping Schuyler document the complete history of Operation Lazarus for use in future ethics instruction. Their collaboration had produced a comprehensive case study that would serve as the foundation for moral courage training throughout the Air Force. "Captain," he had said during their final meeting, "Phoenix Squadron's story needs to be told completely someday. Not just the classified version for military instruction, but the full truth for history." Schuyler had agreed, with the understanding that full disclosure would have to wait until the ongoing investigations were complete, and the people responsible for covering up war crimes had been held accountable. But she'd authorized Riley to begin compiling a complete record, with the promise that it would eventually be declassified for public consumption. The promise of eventual transparency represented the final piece of Operation Lazarus, ensuring that the lessons learned from Phoenix Squadron's sacrifice would benefit not just military personnel, but civilian society as well. The questions of conscience and duty that had defined their final mission were relevant to anyone in positions of authority, regardless of whether they wore uniforms. As Schuyler prepared for another day of instruction, reviewing lesson plans that would challenge young officers to think beyond standard procedures and institutional loyalty. She reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from the skies over Syria to a classroom in Nevada. The woman who had been mocked for her disabilities just months earlier was now recognized as one of the most important military educators of her generation. The pilot who had been officially dead for 5 years was shaping the future of military ethics through her influence on officers who would carry her lessons into positions of increasing responsibility. But perhaps most importantly, the principles that Phoenix Squadron had died to protect were now institutionalized within the American military, creating structures that would support future officers who found themselves facing similar moral crises. The cost had been extraordinary, but the results were already saving lives and protecting civilians in conflict zones around the world. The neon blue hair that had once drawn mockery had grown out completely, revealing the natural auburn that better suited her new role as an instructor. But Skylar had kept one reminder of her time in hiding: the adaptive gloves that had enabled her to fly despite her injuries. They served as daily reminders of the price of moral courage and the importance of never giving up on principles that mattered. As students began filing into Building 7 for another day of instruction, Skylar prepared to continue the mission that had defined Phoenix Squadron's legacy, not through combat operations or classified missions, but through the careful cultivation of moral courage in the next generation of American officers. The ghost of Phoenix Squadron had finally found peace, not in revenge or vindication, but in the knowledge that their sacrifice continued to protect innocent people through the actions of officers who understood that true service sometimes required the hardest choice of all: doing what's right when doing what's easy would be so much simpler. Outside the classroom windows, F-16s and F-22s continued their training flights across the Nevada desert, their pilots carrying lessons that had been written in blood and sacrifice above the skies of Syria. Phoenix Squadron's final mission was complete, but their influence would continue for generations through the moral courage of officers who remembered that some principles were worth any price. The transformation was complete. The mocked pilot had become the teacher. The supposed traitor had become the guardian of military ethics. The ghost had become the foundation for a legacy that would outlive everyone who'd witnessed her return from the dead. And in classrooms around the world, young officers continued to learn that heroism wasn't about impossible feats of skill or strength, but about the quiet courage to do what's right when the cost of doing so seemed unbearable. Phoenix Squadron's greatest victory wasn't the battles they'd won or the missions they'd completed. It was the example they'd set for everyone who came after, proof that conscience and duty could coexist even under the most challenging circumstances. The story that had begun with mockery and humiliation had become something greater, a testament to the power of moral courage and the importance of never abandoning principles that protected the innocent. It was exactly the kind of legacy that heroes were supposed to leave behind, even when those heroes preferred to remain in the shadows where their influence could continue to grow. The final bell echoed through Building 7 as another generation of pilots departed with lessons that would shape their careers and possibly save countless lives. Skylar gathered her materials, her scarred hands steady now, the tremor finally conquered through purpose rather than therapy. Outside, the Nevada sun painted the tarmac gold, and somewhere in the distance, young voices discussed ethics and conscience with the passion of those who'd glimpsed the true cost of service. Phoenix Squadron's mission continued not through classified operations or congressional hearings, but through the quiet conversations of officers who understood that the hardest battles were often fought within oneself. The ghost had become a teacher, the legend had become a legacy, the story had become immortal.